I want you to forget what you think you know about naval warfare. Forget the great battle lines, the thunder of massive guns. The true story of the Pacific War was written not on the surface, but in the silent, crushing darkness beneath it. It's a story of a weapon that failed, of the men who refused to accept that failure, and of an enemy so blinded by their own brilliance that they never saw the noose tightening around their neck until it was too late. This is the story of the American Torpedo, and how its redemption spelled the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy. My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed, and I am a naval historian. For 2 decades, I've studied the logs, the personal letters, the technical manuals, and the bitter regrets that define this hidden war. What I found was not just a tale of engineering, but a profound lesson in the cost of arrogance. In the desperate days following Pearl Harbor, the U.S. submarine fleet was America's only offensive weapon in the Pacific, and its primary weapon was the Mark 14 torpedo. It was the product of 2 decades of peacetime development and a budget of just over $150,000 for its initial design. A pittance, even then. It was a complex beast, over 1.5 tons of high explosives, intricate gyroscopes, and a revolutionary magnetic influence exploder, the Mark 6. This exploder wasn't supposed to just hit a ship. It was designed to detonate underneath it, using the ship's own magnetic field as a trigger. The theory was sound. Breaking a ship's keel was a death sentence far more efficient than a hole in the side. But theory and the brutal reality of the Pacific were 2 different things. The first problem was depth. The Mark 14, thanks to a critical miscalculation in its testing, ran on average 11 feet deeper than set. A submarine commander would creep to within 1,000 yards of a massive 10,000-ton Japanese tanker, set his torpedoes for a shallow run under the hull, and watch through his periscope as the trails of bubbles passed harmlessly beneath the target. The ship wouldn't even flinch. Commander Tyrell Jacobs of the USS Sargo was one of the first to experience this agony. After a fruitless patrol, where not a single one of his torpedoes exploded on target, he conducted a desperate test. He aimed a torpedo at a sheer cliff face in a remote anchorage. The torpedo ran true, hit the cliff, and vanished in a puff of water. No explosion. It had simply crumpled. This led to the second, more insidious flaw, the contact exploder. The firing pin mechanism, housed in the nose of the torpedo, was fatally flawed. When it struck a target at a perfect 90-degree angle, it sometimes worked. But at the oblique angles common in an attack, the pin would bind, jamming in its housing. The torpedo would hit with a sickening, dull thud, a sound some sailors reported hearing through the hull, and then nothing. It was a dud, a $10,000 dud that had just given away the submarine's position. And then there was the magnetic exploder, the pride of the Bureau of Ordnance. It was so sensitive that the Earth's own magnetic field at the equator, fluctuations in water pressure, even the wake of the target ship could cause it to detonate prematurely, hundreds of yards short of its target, or it wouldn't detonate at all. The submariners called them popped, prematures, or clunks. Their own command, the Bureau of Ordnance, refused to believe them. They blamed the skippers for poor marksmanship. The atmosphere in the submarine force shifted from determined aggression to a kind of bleak, fatalistic fury. They were being sent on suicide missions with a weapon that was not just ineffective, but actively betraying them. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, intelligence reports filtering in spoke of incompetent American submariners who couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. The Japanese dismissed them entirely. It was a judgment they would come to regret, written in the cold, dark water. To understand the Japanese reaction, or lack thereof, we must step into their world. The Imperial Japanese Navy of 1941 was not just a military force. It was the embodiment of Yamato Damashi, the unique, unconquerable spirit of Japan. This was not mere propaganda. It was a deeply held cultural and strategic doctrine. They believed that spiritual purity, discipline, and the willingness to embrace death gave them an inherent superiority over materialistic, comfort-loving Westerners. This philosophy was made steel in their warships. The Yamato and her sister, ship Musashi, were the ultimate expression of this. They were the largest, most heavily armed battleships ever built, designed to win a decisive battle against the American fleet, a single apocalyptic engagement that would break American will. Their technology was not meant for a war of attrition, but for a single, perfect victory. Alongside this, they had developed what was arguably the best torpedo of the war, the Type 93 Long Lance. This 24-inch diameter monster used pure oxygen instead of air, giving it an incredible range of over 20 miles, far beyond what any American torpedo could achieve, and it left almost no wake. It was a weapon of stunning technical audacity. When early reports suggested American torpedoes were failing, it perfectly confirmed the Japanese worldview. Of course, the Americans had faulty weapons. They lacked the spiritual discipline, the attention to detail, the kokutai, the national polity, that produced a weapon like the Long Lance. An American submarine captain was an individualist. A Japanese captain was a vessel for the emperor's will. This cultural chauvinism created an intelligence blind spot of catastrophic proportions. To admit that the Americans could fix their torpedoes was to admit that American ingenuity and industrial pragmatism could rival Japanese spirit. It was an unthinkable thought, so they didn't think it. They filed the reports and focused on their dream of the decisive battle, a battle that was rapidly becoming obsolete. By mid-1943, the whispers began. They were faint at first, lost in the static of a global war. A tanker, the Kyoko Maru, vanished en route to Singapore. The official report listed cause unknown. Then another, the Arisan Maru, disappeared. Then a third. The losses were initially attributed to the increasing reach of American aircraft, or to mines. But a sharp junior logistics officer named Jiro Tanaka noticed a pattern. The ships weren't disappearing in random locations. They were being picked off along the most critical, heavily trafficked oil routes from the Dutch East Indies to the home islands. Tanaka, a meticulous man who had studied in America briefly before the war, began to compile data. He cross-referenced loss reports with known Allied air patrol areas and minefields. The correlation was weak, but the timing coincided with a sharp increase in Allied submarine sightings. He drafted a preliminary report suggesting, with all the deference his culture demanded, that the Americans may have partially ameliorated their torpedo deficiencies. He presented it to his immediate superior, Captain Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi was a battleship man, a veteran of the gunnery school. He looked at Tanaka's charts, and then at a photograph on his desk of the Yamato firing its 18-inch guns. "Tanaka-san," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you are seeing patterns in the rain. The American submarine is a mosquito. It is an annoyance. It cannot sink the Empire. Their torpedoes are useless. Our destroyer screens are the finest in the world. These losses are from aircraft or bad weather. Do not waste your time on mosquitoes when we are preparing to slay a dragon." The report was shelved. Tanaka was reassigned to tracking Allied convoy movements, a more productive use of his skills. The whisper had been spoken and deliberately ignored. The culture of Yamato Damashi had, in that moment, doomed the very empire it sought to protect. While the Japanese command was silencing its whispers, the American submarine force was staging a full-blown mutiny. It wasn't a mutiny of violence, but of data, desperation, and sheer, unadulterated rage. The catalyst was men like Commander Dudley Mush Morton of the USS Wahoo. On a legendary patrol, Morton and his executive officer, Richard O'Kane, decided to take matters into their own hands. After a torpedo inexplicably circled back and nearly sunk the Wahoo itself, Morton radioed the famous message, "Sighted sub, sank same," referring to his own malfunctioning weapon. But the real rebellion was systematic. Commander Joseph Joey Grenfell of the USS Gudgeon, after a frustrating patrol, took the extraordinary step of ordering his crew to physically disarm the magnetic exploders in his torpedoes, relying solely on the faulty contact pistols. It was a court-martial offense, but on his next patrol he sank 2 ships. The word spread through the fleet like wildfire. Skippers began bypassing the Bureau of Ordnance entirely, writing directly to the commander of submarines, Pacific Fleet, Comsopac, Admiral Charles Lockwood, a former submariner himself, listened. He authorized his own brutal practical tests in Hawaii. He ordered torpedoes fired into a net at Kahulawe. The results were undeniable. The torpedoes ran deep, and the exploders failed. He then took on the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, a bureaucracy known for its arrogance. The fight was vicious. The Bureau claimed the submariners were incompetent. Lockwood, backed with hard data, demanded they fix the weapons. The breakthrough came when a young engineer, with Lockwood's blessing, designed a new firing pin, a simple, robust piece of machined steel that couldn't jam. It was a work of beautiful, brutal simplicity. One by one, the flaws were purged. The depth control was recalibrated. The magnetic exploder was officially ordered deactivated in July 1943. The silent sword had finally been sharpened. The summer of 1943 marks the great turning point that Japanese intelligence failed to see. It was as if a switch had been flipped. American submarines, no longer fighting their own weapons, became the most deadly commerce raiders in history. The strategy, championed by Admiral Lockwood, was simple and merciless. Sink Japan's merchant marine. Destroy its economic lifeblood. This was the unrestricted submarine warfare that would strangle an island nation. The statistics tell the story with cold, horrifying clarity. In 1942, U.S. subs sank about 600,000 tons of Japanese shipping. In 1943, that number jumped to nearly 2 million tons. By 1944, it was over 4 million tons. The mosquito, as Captain Yamaguchi had called it, was now a swarm of locusts, devouring everything in its path. The effects were catastrophic and cascading. Factories in Japan began to slow for lack of raw materials. Aviation fuel had to be diluted with pine root oil, making it less potent and dangerous to use. Soldiers on isolated islands, like Rabaul and Truk, were effectively cut off, left to wither on the vine, as the American strategy dictated. The Japanese anti-submarine warfare ASW doctrine, built around defending a battle fleet, was completely unprepared for this onslaught. Their destroyers were designed for fleet actions, not convoy escort. Their sonar was inferior. Their depth charges were often set too shallow. Most damningly, they refused to implement a convoy system on a large scale for far too long, seeing it as a defensive, cowardly measure. They were still looking for the decisive battle on the surface, while their empire was being systematically dismantled from below. Each tanker sunk meant fewer sorties for Zeros. Each food transport lost meant hungrier soldiers. The war was being lost not in a dramatic fleet engagement, but in 1,000 silent, oily explosions in the night. If there was one single event that symbolized the culmination of this entire tragedy, it was the sinking of the Shinano. Launched in November 1944, she was a converted Yamato-class hull, making her the largest aircraft carrier in the world. A wondrous, monumental 71,000 tons, a floating fortress meant to be a symbol of Japan's enduring power. She was a secret project, and her maiden voyage from Yokosuka to Kure was meant to be a short, secret shakedown cruise to complete her fitting out. Her captain, Toshio Abe, was aware of the submarine threat, but believed his ship's compartmentalization and armored hull made her virtually unsinkable. He also believed, as per doctrine, that American torpedoes were relatively weak. On the night of November 29, 1944, the Shinano was found by the American submarine Archerfish, commanded by Captain Joseph Enright. The Archerfish was on a lone wolf patrol. What followed was a classic submarine pursuit. Enright maneuvered his boat into a perfect firing position. He fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. At least 4, possibly all 6, struck the Shinano on her starboard side. The initial damage was severe, but not immediately fatal. However, the Japanese damage control response was fatally slow and confused. The crews were inexperienced, and many watertight doors had not yet been properly installed. Crucially, the officers, conditioned by years believing American torpedoes were inferior, underestimated the flooding. They didn't believe the holes could be so large, the inrush of water so violent. But the new American torpedoes, with their reliable exploders and corrected depth settings, had ripped open a gaping wound. The Shinano took on a list that became uncontrollable. Just 7 hours after being hit, the immense proud symbol of Japanese naval resurrection capsized and sank. She was the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The message to the Japanese High Command was now unmistakable, written in the cold, drowning steel of their greatest ship. The Mosquito had slain the Dragon. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the work of the U.S. submarine force was complete. They had sunk over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships and more than 200 warships, accounting for 55% of all Japanese maritime losses. They had effectively severed the archipelago from its empire, reducing industrial output and starving the population. It was one of the most successful campaigns of economic strangulation in military history. The legacy of this story is not just one of technological fix, but a timeless lesson in the perils of cultural arrogance. The Japanese High Command was not stupid. They were brilliant tacticians and brave sailors, but they were prisoners of their own worldview. They had built a perfect system for fighting the war they wanted to fight, the decisive gun battle, and were willfully blind to the war they were actually in, a brutal war of industrial attrition. The silent killer was never just the torpedo. It was the sound of a closed mind. It was the sound of Lieutenant Tanaka's report being filed away. It was the sound of Captain Yamaguchi dismissing a Mosquito. It was the sound of the Shinano's crew refusing to believe the evidence of their own flooding compartments. In the end, the Imperial Japanese Navy was sunk by a weapon it had 2 years to prepare for, a weapon it was repeatedly warned about. They rest now, these great ships, in the silent darkness they so fatally misunderstood. And their greatest lesson to us is not about war, but about the necessity of listening, especially to the whispers you least want to hear.